Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted that you're joining us for the 10th event of McKinsey Sustainability's COP26 programme. My name is Harry Bowcott, and I'm McKinsey Sustainability's leader in the UK and Ireland, and it's a real honour to be your host for our programme across COP26. The gathering of global government and business leaders in Glasgow is an important moment, but the transition to net zero is complicated and messy, and we're here to help leaders understand the practical steps that they can take to decarbonise their assets, to reduce their enabled emissions, to build resilience and to launch new sustainable businesses. And it's great to have so many of you here with us today, both in Glasgow and online. And regardless of where you're watching, before we get stuck into the content of the day, I wanted to let you all know that you have the opportunity to ask questions directly of our panel. So if you're here in the room, take the moment to scan the QR code that is coming up, and that will open up the Slido app on your phones. And if you're online, I'm hoping that you can see a chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And so that means that for anybody, either here or online, if something comes to you during the conversation, tap it in, submit it, and our moderators will make sure it gets to the panel. Terrific. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric and Robin. Eric leads our work in sustainability in transport, and Robin does exactly the same in aviation. Eric and Robin, over to you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for coming and joining the panel today. I hope we're going to have an interesting discussion. So transport includes not only road transport, but aviation, shipping, heavy-duty trucking. And it's obviously an incredibly important part of our sector. Not only does it provide the material goods we need to drive industry, it is also responsible for a tremendous amount of jobs, both directly through the sector and indirectly through the industries that it enables. And further, it brings us closer together, right? It provides connection and provides political stability. However, we must recognize that our sector is responsible for around 20% of global emissions. And if we're going to achieve the net zero equation, if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050, our sector has to contribute and contribute greatly. And we've got although we've got some easier to abate sectors, we also have a lot of hard to abate sectors, such as air and shipping. And so with that, we're going to try and discuss what it's going to take to help us decarbonize our sector and what are the challenges that we face, and hopefully we're going to have an interesting panel. And so with that introduction, I'd like to take the time to introduce the panelists that we've got with us today. And so I'll start here all the way to the right. I'd like to introduce Bo Simonson. He's CEO of the Maersk McKinney Moller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. And prior to joining the center, he held a number of prominent positions within shipping technology and innovation, including VP, Head of New Building Strategy and Portfolio at Royal Caribbean Cruises. He was the Director of the Danish Hydrocarbon Research and Technology Center and the VP of the Head of Maersk Maritime Technology, where he was responsible for a large number of projects, including the world's most energy-efficient container ship series, the Tripoli. Welcome, Bo. Thanks. And to his left, we've got Helen Clarkson, the CEO of the Climate Group. The Climate Group is behind many major industry collaborations towards decarbonization, including the Ev100. Helen joined the Climate Group in 2017 as its CEO. In addition to leading the Climate Group team, she also sits on the board of the We Mean Business Coalition, chairs the Finance and Audit Committee for the Sustainable Development Capital Energy Efficiency Income Trust, and is on the Mission Council for Puka Herbs. Before she joined the Climate Group, she worked at Forum for the Future at Doctors Without Borders. Thank you. Welcome, Helen. And finally, Chris Raymond. So Chris is Boeing's first Chief Sustainability Officer and a member of the company's Executive Council. He's worked with Boeing for over 30 years and previously held positions such as the Vice President of Sustainability, Strategy and Corporate Development, Vice President for the Embraer integration, and Vice President and General Manager, Autonomous Systems. Welcome, Chris, and welcome to the panel. Thanks. So to kick it off, I'd just like, if we could
So it's really this, it's a mixture between scaling the technologies and getting the energy efficiency out, working with best practices, and then it's certainly about policy, and it's about first movers.
Let's go to Chris next, and then Helen, since you cover multiple sectors, we'll first hear about aviation, and then if you could give us a bit about a sector broad view.
Yeah, sure. On aviation, one, we're all here because of aviation. Many of us are probably gathering because of aviation, and I think the good news on aviation is it's always competed on fuel efficiency. So the industry has always pursued fuel efficiency because historically that was for cost. But it's increasingly, obviously, for carbon emissions as well. And just as an example, maybe to relate that to everybody, if you took a car and could drive it across the Atlantic, you'd probably take 5 days or so, and you'd probably be responsible for about 500 to 600 liters of fuel. If you took a modern airplane and did that, you as an individual passenger are probably responsible for about 120 liters of fuel. So it has become a more efficient industry over time. But clearly for our industry, if it's going to continue to grow, the carbon emissions of airplanes in flight are the issue. About 80% of the people in the world have never taken a flight. They should be allowed to when they're able or when they want to. But to do that, we're going to have to reduce the carbon emissions of airplanes in flight. And about 70% of those are the larger airplanes, the longer routes that's where about 70 or so % of the carbon emissions come from. And ATAG, I think, has a great report on this that they just updated on Net Zero 2050. So I'd commend that to the industry. And I think it's good that the industry's had sector goals for a while. A lot of industries haven't. It's good that the industry just updated the sector goal to net zero by 2050 at the IATA AGM recently. But our challenge is to continue some things we're doing. The airlines get credit for fleet renewal, more modern fuel-efficient airplanes, operational efficiencies, and then we have to be investing in and pursuing some of the viable technologies of the future. Those will be renewable energies, sustainable fuels, electric, hydrogen perhaps, and then also the application of those into flying machines that can be safely certified. And so that's sort of our big issue, and that's sort of the way we think about it, is in these 4 buckets of fleet renewal, operational efficiency, the introduction of these renewable energies, and the application of those on the flying machines of tomorrow.
Good. Helen?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm from the Climate Group. We're a non-profit organisation. So our sector that we work on here on transport is really, our big focus is road transport. And we run something called the Ev100 Campaign, which is a commitment by businesses to switch their fleets to electric vehicles by 2030. And the reason for having that commitment is that in a market like the UK, more than half the vehicles in a year are actually bought by corporate fleets. And that's what then, they run them for 3 to 5 years, and then they roll down into the second-hand market. So if you want to transform a whole market, you kind of have to start at that top end. So we've been running that for a few years now, and as we've been working with our members, we've got we've got these commitments, the vehicles are there. We're sort of asking, okay, what's the barrier? What's stopping you doing that? Why can't we just get to this tomorrow? The cost, if you look at the full life cycle cost of a vehicle, and LeasePlan, who are one of the world's biggest fleet companies, just did research that showed across Europe, the full life cycle cost for a vehicle in most cases is cheaper for electric than for a combustion engine. So why can't businesses just do it? Well, the big barrier that they cited actually was lack of vehicles. There aren't enough vehicles for them to buy to meet their commitments. And that's taken us into okay, well, why is that? Well, the manufacturers weren't there, and they weren't there because there wasn't a policy signal. So you come back to that systemic effect. Why can't we just switch road transport tomorrow? And that's led us into a lot of work, and today we've been launching the Zero Emission Vehicle Declaration at COP26, which is a commitment from countries, from cities, states and regions, investors, automotive manufacturers and others to say, look, we're really going to bring forward the end date of the combustion engine, so a commitment to zero emission vehicles. And that's going to help us get over the barrier because we have the technology. It's different from the other sectors. Electric vehicles are there, they're competitive, as I've said, but really the problem we have is not an innovation problem, it's a scaling problem. And you get to scale through getting the right signals to the market, which is going to up the manufacturer. So it's really about that kind of systemic shift. And we're on the way now, but the challenge in the sector you asked about is just speed. How quickly can we get there? And can the charging infrastructure, the infrastructure, keep up with the rollout of electric vehicles?
I want to take up something Bo said. You talked about we need a lot of green energy to do some of the things you're talking about in shipping. And I know, in aviation, we need a lot of biomass and we need a lot of energy, and there's a hydrogen question, we need a lot of green hydrogen. How, as a transportation sector, should we look at the trade-offs between the different verticals? Because after all, there's a lot of overlap in the need for feedstock, whether it's green energy, green hydrogen, or biomass, to bring up some of these solutions alive. What can we do as industry to kind of collaborate across our boundaries? I mean, maybe Bo, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd like to start. I think what you just said about demand signals is extremely important. So, I mean, we've known about these fuels and technologies for a long time, but what is really happening now is that in our sector, some of the big players are starting to actually put very concrete demand signals into the market. So it's customers to shipping, and it's actually ship owners. And you've probably all heard Maersk just recently announced the methanol-driven ships. You've heard the customers of the big carriers also starting to put demand signals. So you can see this is happening, and then the suppliers with engine manufacturers and fuel production, technology companies and energy companies are starting to actually mobilize the supply chain. So I think this is an extremely important one. So it's actually not at this point, I don't really see that we are competing at this point. We might, of course, at the end of the day get into a competition point, but probably over the next 5 or 10 years, it's more about actually getting the demand signals out there so we start to get the supplies so that we can actually, in our sector, offer the green transportation, and we can start to actually scale up the delivery of zero carbon transportation.
Helen, do you want to?
Yeah, it's hard to think about the kind of the competition, as you say. We're not at that point yet where there's enough. But it's true that when you start to then roll out electric vehicles and then you're trying to electrify everything, looking at houses and buildings, there is going to come a point, it's like how, what's on the grid, how big are grids, how are we fueling the grids? And I think that's why it's really important to get all these different levels, so national government, states and regions, cities involved in this question, because we've got to start seeing these systemic shifts. At the level of companies, we have companies that are committed to our Ev100 campaign, which is around renewable energy, and then having made that commitment and starting to see, like, well, let's look at electric vehicles as well and energy efficiency. So I think at the level of the companies, you're getting this really intelligent sort of shift towards systems thinking, and it's now about how we kind of encourage and support that elsewhere.
I think, Robin, 15 years ago in aviation, we would ask, can we even fly an airplane on a sustainable fuel? And that was the question, I'd say, in the early 2000s. And come around about 2007, I think the industry started to qualify a few fuels. And so I don't know that there's a competition issue yet. Maybe that will happen. That'd sort of be a good problem to have if it happened, I think. And in our industry, I think anything that scales in this industry has to first be technologically viable. And then there has to be a certification path. And that's very important in this industry. This industry certification standards, as you would want them to be, are very stringent. And if a fuel doesn't work in a car, it pulls off to the side of the road. That's not going to be true for aviation. And so we have to make sure that whatever we're going to use as a fuel can get through the certification standards, and then we have to deal with whatever infrastructure has to change, and then we deal with the market adoption questions. And clearly on the market adoption, the signals are there. I think I heard a figure the other day that said globally the airlines have sort of signaled something in the neighborhood of approaching 10 billion gallons of sustainable jet fuel, the if it existed and at certain prices question. I think the messiness, Robin, will be about the green premiums that occur. But if I go back to the beginning, one reason that the industry's focused on SAF is there are a lot of technology plays, and there will be different feedstocks that are used in different parts of the world. And there's a lot of technology occurring at the front end, which is really exciting. Companies like Jennifer's at LanzaTech or Sky Energy and companies like this that are out there very focused on this at the front end. 7 of these pathways have already been approved and qualified. Now more need to be qualified, but originally 7 were qualified through the ASTM qualification process to become a drop-in fuel. And that fuel has been used by a lot of airlines around the world. I know in the audience today is Alaska Airline. They just completed 100% fuel, 100% sustainable flight on their eco demonstrator program. You've seen in the recent weeks, United, Rolls-Royce, Etihad, most sustainable flight. So everybody is proving this out. FedEx first did it in 2018 with a 777 airplane on 100% sustainable fuel in their eco-demonstrator program. So we've answered the, is it viable? We know how to qualify them. It takes a while, but we know how to qualify them. And now we're in these sort of, how does this scale up? And that's where I think we're at the stage now where there are policies that will help capital flow to the industrialization of this. And that's the exciting part, I think, that we're in now, is how do we make that happen? And things like blender's tax credit in the United States, I think, is one way. That's one way to do it. And obviously that one is popular in the industry because it's, I think there's a feeling that if we could get that done, you could really start to see some of that production scale. And companies would draw the capital that they need for a long-term project finance.
So if we're not seeing a lot of competition for the similar feedstocks, maybe we switch the topic to collaboration. And what's interesting is we represent here such a diversity of sectors. Do you see a role for collaboration across sectors? Is there stuff that you can learn from shipping and aviation? Is there co-development that you see as possible? Or even better, is there already some type of collaboration that's going on that you'd be excited about to share? And I know, Helen, by definition, you're kind of focused on collaboration. But so maybe we start with you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, well, not about the aviation shipping, but yesterday I was running an event on, it was Innovation Day, and we were looking at zero-emission vehicles, and all day it was just partnership, 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 and we were hearing partnerships, the new leadership. I think it's really exciting to see, because I think a few years ago, I talked to businesses, and of course, the kind of competition mindset, very hard-wired, not in the NGO world, but and we're sort of going, look, you're not competing over, grams of carbon yet. How do we collaborate and get there quicker? And I think companies starting to realize that actually there's a way of engaging one another and keeping that kind of level playing field. And that's where, we run these corporate commitment campaigns, companies make these commitments. We'd love some healthy competition on how quickly they can get there, but learning from one another is a key part of that. And so that's often sort of within a sector or, similar companies working on the same thing. But the idea of bringing them together and actually saying, yes, it's about individually you hitting your own targets, but how do we harness that power of collective action? And a lot of that is around the policy side, because governments want to hear from businesses. At the minimum, they're not going to be shouted at in the press if they do something ambitious. And so you get this really interesting interplay where business can go a bit ahead of government, and that encourages government to go a bit further still. And that's what we're trying to push. And so the 2030 end date that the UK government announced about a year ago, when COP kind of should have been, was because we brought together something called the UK Electric Fleets Coalition, sort of spearheaded by BT, NatWest were in there, other British companies saying to a British government, be ambitious, we will back you. And I think that's really important, and that's what we're trying to bring about.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And we're working with a systemic challenge. We're working with a systemic transition for shipping. Our focus is on shipping. But of course, when you work with a system like that, that is in a context of a lot of other systems that are connected. So very concretely, what we have done is try to connect the supply or the value chain from end to end, from energy companies and utilities and ports and ship builders and ship owners and all the way up to the customer. And of course, those different pieces of the value chain are connected also. So for example, the energy companies we are working with are of course also thinking about off-takers in aviation and heavy trucking and so on and so forth. So I think very naturally this becomes very interconnected, and you can't sort of carve out one value chain in this. You really need to work with this as an ecosystem. So this is surely what we are doing, and it means very concretely that we are also working with aviation, for example. We're also working with standards that need to work across sectors. So for example, life cycle analysis standards doesn't make sense to have these very different between the different sectors. And like I said, also on the energy supply side, we just need to collaborate on what do we use, or how do we turn all that renewable energy into something that is widely adoptable. So I really think collaboration is a key word here. And by the way, collaboration is also the red thread in many of the conversations in the COP discussions now. And that to us is just a very, very concrete thing in how we set up our partnerships and how we set up our work programs.
Can I just add one thing on that? So I used to do a lot of work with businesses about their sustainability, and they'd often map their own, life cycle emissions. And there was always a bit in the middle that said shipping, and we don't know what happens here. And it's really good to see that sort of moving, because it is a good chunk if you're, Unilever or whoever. And it was always like mystery box. And it's, now we know that every bit of the economy has got to decarbonize and starting to work on that.
And I think it comes into your supply chain that way, just like Helen just said. I think transportation, warehousing, and logistics, you got to go start talking to some of your suppliers that you maybe never talked to about these things before. Said, right, what are you doing? Because whatever you're doing could help my scope 1 or my scope 2 or my upstream scope 3. So it's important to get outside. And I think, we've really learned a lot in the last year just by talking to other people. And I think whether it's companies that are helping you benchmark even things as simple as your sustainability report. But we joined something called the MIT Consortium on Sustainability and Climate Change. It's been really interesting because we're meeting companies from outside of our sector that are also hard to abate in dealing with things. Dow Chemical, for example, has been a great partner to talk to for that perspective. The First Movers Coalition that I think Bo talked about, one of the reasons we did it was partly to meet companies like Bo and get more relationships with companies in other hard-to-abate sectors. So I think partnering outside of our industries to look for kind of what are those things people are doing and do they apply to our industry, and maybe we can learn something faster from doing that. And I think that will be one thing. And then I think advocacy. When I first got this job, I sort of thought, right, SAF, you've got all these sort of ecosystem of players. If you had a round table and they were all around the table, because individually they all said, oh, we need a policy. So then I started thinking, well, would they all say we need the same policy, or would they all say we need 5 different policies? And what makes it a policy acceptable to your piece of the puzzle? And I think McKinsey and people like that can convene these cross-sector discussions to see if we could align policy. And what if, airlines and oil companies and banks and the ag industry were actually all speaking and advocating for the same policy for how we scale SAF? That might reduce the friction in the process. So maybe naive, but I think there's a lot of really interesting and frankly inspiring conversations occurring across sectors right now, because it does take some alignment across some of these sectors to get some of these things to scale.
I think there's also an extremely important point about the target setting, and the fact that we're talking about the Paris Agreement, but we've still not completely come to terms on how we actually set our targets in the different sectors. And this is an extremely important part of it. We're talking about hard-to-abate sectors, less hard-to-abate sectors, talking about do they follow the same tact, or are they synchronized or not, etc. I mean, there are some very fundamental things that we need to get our arms around, and the only way of doing that is also collaboration. We really need to have an openness and a very collaborative spirit between us to get the understanding of how we do that.
Very good. So you mentioned hard-to-abate sectors, right? And I think with hard-to-abate sectors within transportation, one of the challenges is we're looking to future technology, whether it's novel propulsion and aviation, or it's future technology for cars, et cetera, to be part of the solution. But we also have the need to do pragmatic things in the short term with solutions that already exist. So how do we find the right balance between investing into things that are uncertain and that might still be science fiction, hopefully come alive soon, but also get impact today and invest in the things we know that work today, even if they're not perfect solutions? How do we get that balance right? Chris, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I think the balance is always a hard question, I think, when it comes to hard things like dollars and your investments and things like that. But I think we'll always stay focused on the product improvements we need for fleet renewal. The airlines will upgrade, probably over the next 20 years, you'll see about 50 to 60% of the airplanes that are going to be sold into the world will be replacements. And so the airlines will be renewing fleets, which will get about a 15 to 20% maybe better fuel efficiency on those airplanes. So I think making sure that we're continuing to improve existing products. And that's why the Eco Demonstrator, that's our tool that we use in partnership with some of our airlines. It's currently with Alaska. It was here in Glasgow about a month ago. And I think that helps us mature things. If you'd have gone back 5 or 6 years, or maybe I guess 7 or 8 years, winglets were an idea that was matured on an eco-demonstrator program, and we figured out, could we certify it? What's it going to take to install it on an airplane? And improve fuel efficiency. And so we've got to keep focusing on improving the current products, making sure that when there is adequate supply of SAF, and let's say we were lucky enough to have the problem that supply was not just 50-50 blends, but every day 100%. And we tried to step out and said, what if that existed today? What if we just assume supply exists? What would have to happen to the product and to the engines? Would anything have to happen? What would we need to change? What about the maintenance procedures at an airline? Do they have to change, or do they not have to change? So we need to work on that now. And we didn't want supply to be the sort of the issue that held us back. We just started working on it. And people like Rolls-Royce and GE and Pratt are right there beside us working on that. So I think you got to keep doing that, even as you invest in the new technologies. And we're building an all-electric airplane. We wanted to learn how to design one. We wanted to learn how to build one. We wanted to learn what electrified powertrain meant in aviation. We wanted to start learning how you certify it. How are we going to certify those with the regulators? And if you could certify one, what about hundreds or thousands of them in the airspace around our cities? Where are we going to pick them up? Is it like calling an Uber where it picks you up on the corner wherever you are? Are we going to have to go somewhere like a bus stop? We got to figure that stuff out if we're really going to scale these things. So we're building one of those machines in California. We've flown it over 1,500 times. It's been a lot of learning. And then we've flown 5 airplanes right now on hydrogen already. Most of those have been on hydrogen fuel cells of 2 or 3 different types. We flew one in 2008, a 2-person airplane, totally on hydrogen fuel cell power. We learned a lot from that. We applied that to other fuel cells. We flew a fuel cell on a 737 to provide part of the electrical power. We flew an airplane on liquid hydrogen. We learned a lot about that and what it's going to take to develop the tank systems. So we've got to keep pushing those things, but we can't let that get in the way of doing things that will help the here and the now. And that means making sure that we're still working on the existing fleets, the operational efficiencies, and the scaling of SAF, I think is kind of how we think about it.
Thank you, Chris. Helen, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably come at it from a different angle. You know, I think we've known for a long time about the costs of inaction on climate. And so I do think we need to, like, different financial models and different ways of assessing this. You know, we need to think about the road to 2050, and that is going to see, you know, business as usual is gone, right? And we've got to kind of rip up some of the rule books and try and understand investments in a different way. So I think the challenge, and probably a challenge from McKinsey, because you guys help kind of write some of these, the rule books for businesses, is like, how do we properly value the future? How do we understand what investments mean over 5, 10, 20 years? Because that's different. And we can't just keep using the kind of financial tools. You know, I trained as an accountant. It's, you know, great, discounted cash flow analysis, whatever, you do it on a spreadsheet, but that doesn't have climate change and massive disruption to supply chains and massively different external, you know, externalities built into it. So I think understanding that a bit better can help us understand how to make decisions today. And so having scared everyone, you know, the other side of that is we were hearing, again, yesterday from a lot of the automotive companies who've made some big moves, just how, you know, it's helping them attract talent. And I think some of these things where, you know, you're just looking at the specific investments now or kind of trying to get that business case together, we're missing some of the things about, you know, social license to operate, attracting talent, and all the things that go with progressive businesses who are really grasping this and tackling it.
Oh, depends, of course, completely on where you are in the ecosystem. So who are you in the ecosystem? But if you take the ship owner, who's a very central player in our ecosystem in terms of making decision and leaning in and driving this, there's a number of things you can do actually to get going. And of course, the first one is to realize whether you want to lean in and be part of the transition or not. And to be honest, there are companies out there today that just say, it's not for us. We'll let somebody else run with that, and one day it becomes regulation, and we'll comply with it whenever it comes. But if you are a progressive ship owner in this case, who wants to be a part of it and who wants to help shape the future, then there's a number of things you can do actually. And the first one is energy efficiency. For most, there's still a lot of potential in driving energy efficiency. So some companies have even been able to grow their business by, let's say, 40 or 60% and stagnate the emissions, which is a very good example of what is possible. But it's not the whole industry who's doing that. So that is one. Secondly, it's about understanding the technology roadmap. And that you don't have to do alone. You can connect to our center, for example, or you can set up collaborative arrangements where you're actually sharing the investment and the risk in getting insights into these new opportunities on the technology side. And finally, and I think that's the most important, most companies can actually start to work with their suppliers and their customers to figure out how to actually be able to offer a zero-carbon transportation product or service. And I think that's a really interesting one because, to be honest, many of the companies, and that's even if you're a small bulk carrier or small tanker company, the day the customer comes and asks for the zero-carbon transportation, if you're not ready to provide that service, it's going to take a long time to get the business processes in place to do that. So there's a lot of preparatory work here to be done that doesn't require massive capex and investments, but that is actually preparing your business for the future. And of course you need to lean in, and some have the power to lean significantly into this and actually start building ships and building infrastructure that can do it. So others don't have the power, the balance sheet, and the capacity to do that, but they can still prepare themselves for the future.
I'd like to touch on a couple of the themes that we just heard. You know, Helen, you mentioned the road to 2050 and net zero, and 2050 is a long time away, and all of you mentioned a little bit about the need to get started now. So maybe for the industries that you represent or that you're involved in, can you give us a little bit of view of, say, 5 years from now? What milestones are we hitting that we know we're on the right path? Right? Obviously, we can't wait till 2050. We've got to get started now. So what does your industry look like 5 years from now that signals we've understood the 1.5 degree challenge and we're on our way? I don't know who wants to start. Well,
I can start, yeah. Okay. 5 years from now, we will see ships that are running on new kinds of zero-carbon fuels. We will see certainly some ships that are running on methanol. This is already possible today. We'll see ships running on e-methane and biomethane, and hopefully also ammonia and maybe some of the other hydrogen-based fuels. Fuels that are scalable. So that is, we will not be at scale in 5 years from now, but we should see sort of the supply chain enabled to actually demonstrate that ships can run on these new fuel and energy sources. And this should also, at the same time, give the clarity to give us, you can say, the standards and the regulation. It might not be adopted at that point, but we should start to see significantly more confidence in the global regulation at that point, so that actually capital starts to flow also to the infrastructure scaling, so that we actually start to see the supply of these new fuels. And we are aiming for, I would say, the sector, the leaders of the sector. And today we had, for example, the Clyde Bank Declaration and the First Movers Coalition talking about 5% in 2030. And in order to reach 5% in 2030, in 2025, we need to see all of these main pathways enabled so that it can actually start to scale. I think that would be my bet for 25.
Yeah, so in the next 5 years, passenger vehicles will be cheaper upfront cost than a combustion engine. So that's going to really change the market, across Europe and North America and places like that. So that's going to be the really big shift, is when those cost curves cross one another. I think we're going to see a really big rollout of the charging infrastructure. We're already seeing that go much quicker. And if you look at the figures this year versus 2 years ago, it's like up by 60%. So that's sort of really accelerating. So I think within 5 years, there's not going to be a kind of, we're not going to do a panel on electric, certainly not electric passenger vehicles, right? Because that's going to be done and dusted on its way. Most people will be sort of starting to buy, those of us who buy cars second or third hand are starting to buy them at that point because they're rolling through fleets and things. So really then we're on to the heavier goods vehicles, and we're already seeing those being piloted now. And I think the panels in 5 years' time at COP are going to be, how do we get those to scale and move beyond the pilot phase?
I wanted to compliment Helen. I loved her comment about the next generation of talent. I had to come back on that. When I think about stakeholders of our company, and I think first and foremost the employees of your own company, current, let's start with current. They have to be believers. They have to be the ambassadors of what your company is trying to do. And I don't think we can sort of take that for granted. I think we have to work at that. And the future talent, if you're trying to attract it to your company, this is going to be more important, and you're going to have to face into it regardless of what regulation says, in my opinion. But I think, you know, probably the 5-year mark, I think you will see as many airlines talk about fleet renewal for the carbon emission reduction reasons. I think that might lead with that going forward. I think you'll see a lot of that. I think air traffic management and sort of efficient flying, maybe we can finally get over the hump on that. And I think the digital technologies in airplanes today, one of the things I've seen so many airlines demonstrate with their air traffic providers is sort of things like continuous descent or real-time air traffic routing, and the fuel efficiency savings they get from that. It's not trivial. And so if we could really advance those things, they may not sound like the banner headline issues, but they're really important. And then I think no doubt you're going to see larger prototype vehicles with some of these novel propulsions on them. You might even see some of the urban air mobility vehicles get to sort of initial certification, past actual cert basis, and actually get, you know, certified in 5 years at the sort of the urban mobility class vehicle. And then we'll be working on the airspace integration and the volumes of those that people want to put in the airspace. It's no longer a technology problem. Back to my 4 buckets, just about anybody can build an all-electric airplane. A lot of people can do that. And we need to get through the certification and the scaling now. So I think those will be some things that we'll see at the 5-year mark. And anyway, yeah, I think it'll just be an exciting time in aerospace. There's a lot of innovation going on, I think, right now in aerospace. And I think it'll be an exciting time. And, you know, clearly I think SAF, we'll see sort of SAF scaling by this time. And, you know, it'll be more than just sort of 10 million gallon pilot projects. While those will remain very important as we prove out new technologies, I think we'll start to see mainstream industrialization of some of these in some parts of the world. And that'll be really exciting to see as the industry pivots to that industrialization.
That's an exciting future ahead of us. So one thing that we'll see from business perspective is we'll see new players enter the value chains here in the ecosystem, right? And aviation might be agriculture playing a role all of a sudden to provide feedstock, or, you know, power grid providers for charging EVs. What are some of the changes in the ecosystem that you're seeing, and what advice do you have for business leaders as they're thinking about these shifts in value pool in the ecosystem, how they should prepare for that in the transition? Go ahead, Bo.
I mean, we're seeing that already. So we're seeing today an industry where 99.8% of the fuel is basically on the same standard. It's fossil fuel, and we know exactly what that is. And then we're seeing now in the ecosystem, we're seeing a lot of new players that want to produce the fuels of the future, which is super exciting, of course. And I think we can expect some big disruptions in who's actually going to produce that fuel. So I think a lot of well-established companies should be ready for a lot of new players and a lot of competition. So I mean, just to mention some examples, maybe ammonia is expected to play a role. And ammonia is today, it's 180 million tons of ammonia being produced every year, mainly to be used in agriculture as a fertilizer. And so are those companies going to produce the fuels of the future for shipping? That's a completely new game. Carbon capture and storage might play a role in terms of producing blue fuels. There are completely new players in that space as well, combining those with fertilizer producers and new players on renewable energy scenes. I just think there's so much very exciting stuff going on in that energy and fuel space that we must expect disruptions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really exciting disruption going on in the automotive space, and we've seen a lot of sort of born electric companies that just start and grow. A lot going on in India. We do quite a lot of work in India. So yeah, it's been interesting today. We've had this, big declaration. The media, of course, have kind of combed through, okay, who didn't sign it? And I just think, there's a lot of kind of potentially thinking, well, we're not quite ready yet, but it's really clear the direction of travel. And so I think that not jumping on this now and not switching and not taking those bold moves, it's the kind of Netflix blockbuster moment, I think, in the automotive industry. And there's always this kind of assumption that creative destruction comes for someone else. So I think this is this very clear moment. And we're going to see quite a lot of shifts, and then shifts about where things are made and how things are transported in the process. You need fewer components in an electric vehicle, so how does that play out? Quite a lot of interesting things to happen, I think.
I think sort of to be successful in that environment, I think our CEO likes to use this term import best practices. And so you really got to be, I think, close enough to some of these things that are going on, you know, Robin. I think so being out there and engaging some of these people and not assuming, you know, that you've got it figured out. I think we have a term we use all the time, like, are we close enough to that? And so I think being out there and engaged with some partners, you'll see a lot of new partnerships. I think the fuels that Bo talked about, I think there's going to be a lot of new entrants. You know, they may not do the whole value stream, but there's going to be new entrants on the feedstock end or new entrants on the production side. I do think we could see new fuel providers. Is it always going to come through the traditional sources, or are there going to be new sources of that with these new cleaner fuels? I think that will be really interesting. I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting developments in hydrogen as it goes from brown to green. And, you know, we shouldn't let blue be the enemy of the perfect, right? And so if we get to blue, that's a good next step. And so we're going to see things like industrial carbon capture, I think, proliferate a bit more. And then that'll become direct air capture and the potential of that becoming feedstocks for fuels. And so I think you just have to be out in some of these other industries and engaging and staying close enough to it. And we will see sort of new people. One thing I would say in my 35 years, I mean, there's been these interesting times, but there is a lot of technology innovation going in and around aerospace. And anytime that happens, anytime you have that degree of smart people and that amount of money, whether it was SPAC fueled or hedge fund fueled or venture fueled, anytime there's that amount of excitement around a technology development, it's going to mature faster. Will it get through all those buckets that I mentioned? You know, but there's certainly going to be a lot on the technical end that is going to mature faster. And you just have to stay close to that, figure out where can we start applying it now and what things are going to have to wait until we're through some more of those stages. But it's a really interesting time, I think, in aerospace right now, just because of the amount of technology innovation going on.
So we're starting to get some questions roll in from the live audience. So I'd like to try and bring in some of these. The first one that I'll throw out here is one that is after my own heart, which is around carbon transparency. So for those of us who've been working in decarbonization for a while, we know that even with the best of intentions, a lot of carbon accounting right now is a bit of a fiction, right? It's a bit of a fiction just because, especially outside of our own walls, we don't know, what our suppliers are emitting or their suppliers are emitting. So a lot of the topics that we talk about today do require some level of, robust, verifiable tracking and tracing of carbon throughout our entire supply chains. So just would be good to get a few words on how you're thinking about that. How critical do you think that is? Can you make progress without it? Is it an enabler for progress? How important is carbon transparency in your net zero journey?
I mean, I think it's pretty important. If you're going to say net zero, it sort of presumes you have at least some idea of what your emissions are that you're trying to get to net zero. I don't think probably any company's got the perfect accounting for that yet, but I think that term Helen mentioned, carbon accounting, I think is going to become sort of a more maturing term in all companies. I think finance functions of companies are going to get more sort of facile with it. I think we're going to all have to learn more about it, how you build it into business decisions. And I think the auditing firms are sort of going through this too, you know, of sort of as the pressure mounts to sort of do some limited assurance of non-financial reporting and things like that. What are they auditing to? You know, what is the standard? Is there a gap standard like we all accept in big public companies? And so what's going to be the auditing mechanism? I know in our case we've got gaps in our emissions calculations, but on scope 1, scope 2, we've tended to use CDP as a guide over time. We started following that in, I'd say, the late 2010 or so, and we baselined everything in 2017. We try to get that independently assessed for scope 2, scope 1, and part of our scope 3, but we've got some gaps, and we've got to continue to figure out ways to quantify those things. And we've been trying to use the greenhouse gas protocol, we're sort of using that taxonomy and that way of estimating things. But some of the estimating is blunt. We all know it, you know, in terms of when you go look in your supply chain and say, right, how am I going to assess the total carbon emissions coming into my four walls from the supply chain? And we do it according to a credible way. We get it validated, but there's probably going to be maturing ways to calculate that. And I think companies are going to all sort of want to know what are they handing to the next phase of the value chain. And there'll be a lot of pressure on, I think, companies to kind of figure that out and mature that. Carbon accounting is the term we're sort of using inside the company on that. And then I think sort of how to price that will also mature, I think. You know, whether we're going to price that with the allowances markets or we're going to price that on eventually what we think a ton of direct air carbon capture removal will cost when it all settles out. How are we going to sort of price that? And I think that will mature a lot over the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. You know, we set these 100% commitments, and the idea of 100% is that, you know, everyone in the company knows it covers them. You don't, if you have 97%, everyone thinks they're in the 3%. It's like, oh, that's nice, they're all doing that, I'm over here. So you've got to have that 100%, and then we have to hold companies accountable and check on their progress. But what that also helps us do is understand, okay, when you get to, because you often see companies get quite quickly up on renewable energy, you might get quite quickly to 70, 80, then it slows, and then you get up into the 90s, and it's like, you know, if you were an accountant, you'd round it, right? But that 2 or 3% that you can't quite do is incredibly important. Is it because, you know, we've got an example with companies who've got operations in Argentina where it's incredibly hard to buy renewable energy, and that helps us then direct our work and understand which markets we need to help work in. We've done a lot of work this year in Asia where we've got companies, global companies, and they're just finding it so hard to buy renewable energy in places like Japan and South Korea, and we can then go and engage with the government. So I think it's really important just both at the individual company level to know how we're delivering on commitments, but also then where can we direct that collective action.
Completely agree. It's extremely important. And maybe just to add a few examples from our world. So first of all, right now in our global maritime organization, IMO, this is one of the key elements being discussed, how to actually establish the standards for that. We believe that the science of life cycle analysis and climate impact is quite well established. So it's more a matter actually of figuring out how to set the standards and how to implement this by use of monitoring, analysis, benchmarking, and reporting. And in our industry, all the fuels and all the energy pathways we're looking at, they have sort of elements where it's extremely important to be quite accurate on this element of true climate impact of the pathways. And methane has been discussed a lot here in the COP, and this is one of the elements where in our world methane could be a small thing or it could be a big thing, but we need to have our arms around it in order to not fool ourselves, but actually make the right decisions in terms of the future powering solution. So I just like to echo that it is extremely important. It's from a scientific point of view, probably not super important. It's more about actually finding out how to implement this in the industry. So this, I would say, is a work stream alongside with the more technical and commercial and financial and regulatory work streams. We have this particular one, which is important. I think also, I hope also that we can use some of the new technologies in this. There's a lot of new sensor technology out there. There's not a lot of new digital technology like blockchain, etc. So hopefully we can get to a point where we don't need to go around with pencils and paper and monitor along the pipelines and so on. So.
Very good. Here's another question from the audience, which is around topics you talked about, efficiency. What kind of global initiatives do we need to really, bring efficiency along? Whether it's in aviation, you talked about air traffic control, or whether it's bringing some of the shippers to the same level as the best in class. How do we get more of that incremental efficiency out of the system? What would you advise?
Yeah, I can start. So, I mean, in shipping, we see large operators that really take advantage of their scale, take advantage of new digital tools and really drive efficiencies. Year on year, you drive the efficiencies. And if we could only apply that practice to the entire industry, we would be so much better off. So again, we don't need to invent any breakthrough innovation here to actually make a lot of improvements. But how do you roll that out in an industry? That's probably about transparency And there are some fantastic digital opportunities today to create transparency around how the global ship is operating. So that's one. And then secondly, it's probably also about policy and regulation, that actually by use of combining digital technologies with some strong regulatory measures, you can actually drive efficiencies very far. So that would be my bet. And then, of course, we're seeing a lot of fancy new ideas for technologies and so on. And I believe that can also play a role, but we are basically saying that we don't even really need shark skin on ships or, super fancy technologies. We can actually do with what we have and drive very large improvements.
Christian.
I was sitting here thinking of our behaviors as consumers, and one of the things we try to do in the company is we have a dedicated group that works on employee conservation behaviors. We run several events of the year like Battle in the Buildings, or we'll do these vampire walks at night to see who's leaving what on. It doesn't sound very interesting, but if we don't get to our own behaviors at some point, all the airlines now have a way for you as individual travelers to probably offset your flight. No, I won't ask for a show of hands, but who's doing it? Who's contributing to the SAF fund that the airlines are starting to offer? My own personal favorite, especially after the last year in the pandemic, is who's clicking the Amazon Day delivery button instead of I just want it to show up tomorrow. And just little things that we're all going to need to do differently. And I think we're going to have to actively work on behaviors. And conservation behaviors are going to be really important. And I think, we've learned a lot from other companies about things they do in that regard. And I think as companies, as people, we're just going to have to look at our own lives and our own work lives and sort of work on these conservation behaviors. And eventually that might get to, being willing to pay the green premiums on some things while they're in that messy transition that Robin talked about at the beginning.
I feel like my answer to everything is I've got a campaign for that. So we run something called the Ev100 Campaign, which is about doubling energy productivity. And we called it energy productivity because we knew that efficiency was getting a bad rap, and we're like, could we make it more exciting? But it's about doing more, economics for every unit of energy you use. It's been one of the hardest campaigns to get going because I think there's just kind of an assumption in a lot of business. It's interesting to hear talk about how you're driving efficiency in the industries, because I think a lot of businesses at the top, there can be an assumption, of course we're not leaving dollar bills on the floor. We've done that, that we couldn't possibly be wasting money effectively. And actually then companies who do sign up and sort of start looking at energy efficiency do often find these efficiencies. And some of them come from kind of employee schemes, or in Hilton Hotel saved so much money engaging their customers in this journey. And so energy efficiency is absolutely critical. And whenever you look at the models for how we get to 2050, energy efficiency is such a big, big part of it. And I think it can be very overlooked because it often isn't very exciting. You don't get to put up a big thing or cut a ribbon or, do all the, fancy stuff that people like doing. And so it's quite hard work. And we want to engage more and more companies in that because there is a lot of efficiency that I think we can find.
We just had a question come in that I think is really important that I'd love to hear your view on. So we spent almost all our time today essentially talking about the tailpipe, or everyone's version of the tailpipe, right? But we're downstream of some really carbon-intensive industries, right? All of our industries, we consume a lot of steel, a lot of aluminum, right? A lot of plastics. And so when we're talking about a net zero journey, it's not just the tailpipe, it's net zero across the entire vehicle. And we as a sector can send a lot of signals upstream. So how are you thinking about fully net zero, not just the tailpipe, but also the materials that we build all of our vehicles with?
Shall I tell you about our Steel Zero campaign?
Go for it. Let's start, Helen.
And so one of our newest campaigns, Steel Zero, which is a commitment to procuring net zero carbon steel by 2050. Now that's longer out than some others because it's not like the other sectors where you've got the technologies already, but it's this, again, creating this demand signal now is really useful for the supply side. And actually, we just saw British Steel set a